Digital Foundry is sponsored by the powerful, upgradable MSI MPG Infinite X2 desktop PC featuring Intel Core processors and NVIDIA RTX 40 series graphics.
2023 was a really great year for gaming. Quite a few games garnered a very warm critical reception, as some long-anticipated and long-delayed games finally released. I had a lot of fun this year too, so I'm going to take you through my top 5 titles for 2023. As always, this is my personal list and reflects no one's opinions but my own. Number 5. The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. I really love The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. It really captured the essence of what a good open-world environment should be, with a flexible and approachable go-anywhere mentality and excellent traversal systems. The game's shrines and non-linear approach to game content were a clean break from prior Zelda adventures, with the actual action and puzzles taking a different physics-oriented flavor as well. Tears of the Kingdom is a lot like Breath of the Wild, so it's not a surprise that I enjoyed it so much. The key development here is that the gameplay is much more physics-based than even Breath of the Wild, accomplishing a lot that we just haven't seen in other titles. Obviously, the Ultra Hand system is the most flashy development here, but the other new abilities are also quite striking. So much careful tweaking and bug testing must have gone into constraining the game's physics so that they work in a predictable and true-to-life way, which I can't imagine was easy at all. But there are some elements I didn't exactly love. The depths area wasn't really my favorite place, and I didn't like the game getting my progress based on rupees, which happened once or twice and was a little bit annoying. The reuse of the map and some key mechanics from Breath of the Wild also make the game feel a little bit less novel, and I preferred this slightly more open game structure in Breath of the Wild as well. Still, Tears of the Kingdom was a really impressive game, and was one of the most memorable game experiences of 2023 for me. Number 4. Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Insomniac's web-slinging sequel delivered basically everything you'd want. The combat is fast and fluid, with key refinements from the first 2 games. There's a lot of content, with a detailed main story and plenty of side missions. The story is well developed and carries some emotional weight. And technically, it's another very polished and great-looking outing from Insomniac. It's a supremely polished game, and one that seemingly was developed in a pretty rapid cycle. The heavily iterative nature of the game probably helps quite a bit here. The city is, to an extent, reused, and a lot of the basic game design has been preserved, but it's still an impressive achievement. If you just play Spider-Man 2 without a refresher on the prior 2 titles, you might be convinced that the improvements are slim, but they do actually play and look a fair bit differently. I'd say the Spider-Man action combat has been just about perfected at this point, with very smooth and punchy basic moves, combined with a variety of splashy special attacks on timers. The new gadget system is less clunky and more action-oriented than the dial-based interface we saw in the earlier games as well. The main story might take 15 hours or so to complete, with some high-quality side missions adding at least a few additional hours, and collectibles and smaller objectives to pad out the experience for interested players. I'm not a huge fan of the industry focus on maximizing game length, and I think a more direct experience is a good change of pace from other titles. It also lets Insomniac deliver a level of polish and quality in each death-defying mission that is absent from a lot of other game efforts. Spider-Man 2 looks great in typical play as well. In close-ups, it perhaps doesn't resolve the same incredibly detailed geometry or super fine lighting detail that you'd see in a game with more restricted scope. But when traversing the environment at breakneck speeds, there's really nothing else like it. Insomniac's commitment to ray tracing pays off hugely here, with perspective correct reflections across New York City that would be impossible to achieve in real time without RT. My only real complaint is that I think the boss fights in the game are a little too intense, with a dramatic step up in difficulty and a huge number of phases. I think the game could have done with fewer or less involved boss encounters. And there's still something about the combat that feels a little bit disconnected from your action at times, without a strong visual representation of enemy damage on screen. Still, I think Spider-Man 2 is a real accomplishment, and one of the best Sony first-party efforts we've seen on the PS5. Number 3. Hi-Fi Rush: A lot of Hi-Fi Rush's appeal is wrapped up in its presentation. Tango Gameworks has done a superb job mimicking the look of 2D animation within 3D game content. Characters are strictly cel-shaded, with bold, uneven outlines that make them a good match for the look of 2D cartoons. Environments use cross-hatched and halftone patterns and are animated in time with the musical beat. Cutscenes in particular are special. These are animated with character movement, keyframed at 15 updates per second, giving them the truncated, staccato movement associated with 2D cartoons. A lot of care has clearly gone into the animation, with dramatic key poses serving as the basis for the game's movement. I absolutely loved the character designs as well. It plays very nicely as well. Generally speaking, it's a very good third-person action game, with fun and flashy combat. At times it becomes a platformer, a side-scroller, or an on-rails action game as well, with quite a bit of variety baked into each stage. I think it's a lot of fun, and the beat-matching gameplay mostly works quite well too. It's just a very memorable and satisfying game to play, and captures a certain inventiveness that we haven't seen much of since the PS2 era. Even though it's not a very long game, it maybe took 12 hours or so to beat on my first playthrough, I think it clocked in at about the right duration for a game like this. My only real complaint is that the environmental design could be a bit more varied, with many stages looking sort of industrial. Some extra variety would have been appreciated, particularly through the middle stretch of the adventure. I really don't have too much else to say, because I think I expressed most of my thoughts in my coverage of the game back in February. Suffice to say that I pretty much knew it would find its way onto my Game of the Year list as soon as I played it. Number 2, Dead Space. Dead Space is a limited game in a lot of ways. It's a remake, it clocks in at about 10 or 11 hours, and the gameplay spaces are on the smaller side. But with those constraints and high budget production values, EA Motive has delivered one of the least compromised games of the year, with very few obvious faults. It helps that I'm a big fan of the original, which I bought on launch day back in October 2008. With superb visuals, a unique setting, and captivating combat, Dead Space was a defining experience for the 7th gen console systems, demonstrating that the relatively new console hardware could deliver a unique horror experience. On the surface, Dead Space's 2023 outing seems very similar, and in a lot of ways it is. If you haven't played the original in a while, it might feel like a strictly visual remake, a new title that takes the gameplay from an older game and revitalizes it with updated graphics. But the Frostbite-powered rebuild gave EA Motive the opportunity to rework the game in some fundamental ways. The ship design is familiar, but the ship layouts have been overhauled in the name of flexibility, with non-linear routes and unlockable shortcuts. Side missions have been added, which flesh out aspects of the story that were left open-ended in the original. A security clearance system has been worked into the game, which encourages exploration as you unlock higher levels. Weapon balancing has been reworked, and a new weapon upgrade system has been added to the game. The story has been retooled, with additions and adjustments that make a lot of sense. The zero-gravity system from Dead Space 2 has been introduced, making zero-G segments less frustrating. Finally, the general handling of character movement and aiming is totally different, with the new game having a more responsive feel. Played in isolation, it does feel very familiar, but if you actually compare the 15-year-old original and the remake side by side, they're really substantially different games. Everything that made the original work so well is preserved perfectly here, however. Action is fast but deliberate, and resource management is key throughout the game. Players have to approach each encounter cautiously, especially on the hard or impossible difficulties, which pose serious challenges, and the general difficulty level of the game has been substantially increased. The game is super moody and thick with atmosphere throughout as well, with a uniquely oppressive feel. The graphics updates are a big part of what makes the game's atmosphere really drip with dread. There's a lot of geometry crammed into every environment, coupled with very effective lighting and volumetrics. The elements of the original game that worked well, like the excellent angular environmental geometry, have been carried over in spirit in the remake, just realized with more advanced rendering tech. Relative to other modern games, there's a bigger focus on real-time lighting here, with limited or absent GI, which is my only real critique. I think the game would look wildly impressive with ray-traced lighting, but it still looks excellent most of the time. And it is worth noting that the key visual issue with the game at launch, the obtrusive variable rate shading system, which led to obvious artifacting and degraded image quality on consoles, has been completely patched out, with a negligible impact on frame rates. Some minor technical issues remain, like traversal stutters and some noticeable frame rate dips in later areas, but the consoles are at least in decent shape overall. Number 1. Final Fantasy XVI. There's something about the launch of a new Final Fantasy game that inaugurates a new console generation. I faintly remember the time around the launch of Final Fantasy X, which seemed so exciting, with its beautiful CGI and extremely detailed characters. I felt much the same way when Final Fantasy XIII launched, which paired outstanding production values with an emotional story and one of the best JRPG battle systems out there. Even Final Fantasy XV, which is not my favorite, really impressed in a lot of ways, and Final Fantasy XVI is no exception. The combat is the heart of Final Fantasy XVI. The core of the action is pretty simple. You have a melee attack, a ranged attack, a dodge, and a special action, alongside powerful special moves on timers. And enemies have a stagger system, like in many prior Final Fantasy games. But it just animates so smoothly, and the various attacks look beautiful, especially the show-stopping special moves that Clive has access to. The general flow of the action feels pitch perfect and super tight and responsive, to a degree I wasn't really expecting. It helps that the enemies you fight also have engaging attack patterns and beautiful moves, and there are some absolutely stunning boss battles here, with gigantic scale. I really admire the game's visual presentation. While early showings didn't exactly have the most impressive graphics, the final game looks extremely accomplished. Characters have a CG-like quality to them, largely matching the quality of CGI renders in Final Fantasy games some years ago. For someone who grew up playing those games, it's a realization of a long-standing dream of mine. The environments look superb as well, and combat is extremely impressive. All of the special attacks are accompanied by wild screen-filling effects, and the game just loves to bombard the player with particle effect treats. Final Fantasy XVI is up there with some of the best-looking games we've seen this generation. The game's structure deserves some praise as well. Instead of the typical open-world environment, Final Fantasy XVI is set in a large number of discrete locations, though some are fairly open-ended. Players simply select an area on the map to travel to, which makes the variance in locations more plausible than you'd see in a typical compressed open-world environment. It also increases the density of interesting things to see, and keeps the pacing brisk. I enjoyed the story, which, though full of twists and turns, is more comprehensible than it seems at first, and is told quite effectively through hours and hours of cinematic cutscenes. The music is outstanding too, blending traditional Final Fantasy melodies with bombastic new orchestral instrumentation. My only real complaint about Final Fantasy XVI is that there's too much of it. The main quest stretches on for about 40 hours or so, and if you sample a decent chunk of the side content, that can easily balloon to 50 or 60 hours. That's not a problem per se, but some of the content in the main story isn't produced with the same level of production values that you usually see, with stiff conversations and some less inspired locales to visit. And the side content is often a little too bare bones, really very MMO-like, even though there are a lot of quests to undertake. I think the game would have been a better and more consistent experience if it had been trimmed down somewhat, especially for the main scenario. And while the game does look beautiful, I do wish Final Fantasy XVI was capable of a solid 60 FPS on PS5 hardware, which it falls short of in its performance mode. In the 30 FPS quality mode, I think the combat feels great and is perfectly responsive, but I've become accustomed to a 60 FPS update in action games, and it does feel like this could have been a decent 60 FPS title, perhaps paired with some upsampling. Hopefully the upcoming PC release will provide a comprehensive solution to this issue. Ultimately, I think that Final Fantasy XVI is head and shoulders my favorite game of the year. It hits every mark I want out of a Final Fantasy title, while adding excellent action combat into the mix. It comes highly recommended. "2023 was a much stronger year for gaming than 2022 in my opinion, with a lot of consistently top quality software that we just didn't see last year. I would have probably ranked every single one of the games today near the top of my list in 2022, for instance. There were a few other games that I really liked this year as well, like Super Mario Wonder, Diablo 4, and Horizon Forbidden West Burning Shores, which all just fell outside of my top 5. Looking ahead to 2024, I'm excited for Persona 3 Reload, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Hellblade 2, Bloodlines 2, and Metaphor ReFantazio. There are some remasters, like the Apollo Justice Ace Attorney trilogy, that I'm looking forward to as well. And I'm sure there are plenty of other great games that haven't been announced yet or specifically penciled in for 2024. On the surface, next year doesn't seem like it has the same density of high-quality titles that we saw in 2023. But I'm sure there will be plenty of surprises. There are also 2 big hardware launches widely tipped for next year: the next Nintendo console platform and a mid-generation PS5 enhanced system. I'm a huge fan of the Switch and its enormous contribution to portable gaming, and I love it when new cutting-edge home consoles drop, so both potential machines really excite me. So here's hoping that 2024 brings some quality gaming, and as always, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.
MSI's MPG Infinite X2 PC features powerful Intel Core processors, the latest RTX 40 series graphics, and supports DDR5 memory up to 128GB, with advanced CPU cooling via MSI's own 240mm all-in-one cooler and system thermals handled by the Silent Storm Cooling 2 solution. Every major component in the system is upgradable with a toolless design for easy access. A tempered side panel and MSI Mystic Light RGB adds to the aesthetic, and the latest Wi-Fi 6E networking is supported. Check the link in the video description for full details on the MSI MPG Infinite X2, the all-new MSI gaming desktop.